The Weight of Love. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. The wedding dress hung like a ghost in the corner of Sarah's bedroom, its ivory silk catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the blinds. She had saved for 3 months to buy it, working double shifts at the diner, taking on extra cleaning jobs, and skipping meals so she could afford the perfect dress for her daughter's perfect day. But now, as she sat on the edge of her bed with her hands trembling in her lap, the dress seemed to mock her. The words Rachel had spoken just an hour ago echoed in the silence of the small apartment. "The best gift you could give me is to disappear from my life. You are the worst mother." Sarah's chest felt hollow, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out everything vital. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears that had been falling steadily since Rachel stormed out. But they kept coming. 32 years. 32 years of her life devoted to one person, and this is what it had come to. The apartment was too quiet now. No sound of Rachel's key in the lock, no hurried footsteps in the hallway, no calls of, "Mom, where's my..." followed by whatever item she couldn't find. Just silence, stretching endlessly like a wound that wouldn't heal. Sarah looked around the room that had been hers for 8 years, ever since they'd moved out of the cramped studio they'd shared when Rachel was in high school. 2 bedrooms, a luxury she'd never imagined she could afford. The walls were decorated with photos spanning decades: Rachel's first steps, her graduation from kindergarten, middle school dance recitals, high school prom, college graduation, a shrine to a daughter who now wanted nothing to do with her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. For a wild moment, her heart leapt. Maybe Rachel was calling to apologize, to take back those cruel words. But it was just a text from her supervisor at the diner. "Can you pick up Tom's shift tomorrow? He's sick." Of course. Even now, even with her world crumbling around her, life demanded she keep working, keep moving, keep providing. Tomorrow was supposed to be Rachel's wedding day. Tomorrow, Sarah was supposed to walk her daughter down the aisle, because Rachel's father had never been in the picture. Tomorrow was supposed to be the culmination of everything Sarah had worked for. Instead, tomorrow would be just another day of serving coffee to strangers and pretending her heart wasn't shattered into 1,000 pieces. Chapter 2. The foundation cracks. The fight had started over something so trivial, Sarah could barely remember it now. Something about the seating arrangements at the reception. Rachel had wanted Sarah at the family table, but not at the head table with the wedding party. "It's just how it's done, Mom," Rachel had said, her voice tight with frustration. But it wasn't really about seating arrangements. It never was. Sarah had worked 16-hour days when Rachel was little, leaving at 5 in the morning to open the diner and not coming home until after midnight from her cleaning job at the office building downtown. She'd missed school plays and parent-teacher conferences, birthday parties, and soccer games. Always working, always providing, always trying to build something stable from the wreckage of her teenage pregnancy and abandonment. "You were never there," Rachel had said during their argument, her voice rising with each word. "Do you know how many times I had to explain to other kids why my mom couldn't come to anything? How many times I had to take care of myself because you were too busy working to notice I existed?" Sarah had tried to explain, the same way she'd tried to explain 1,000 times before. "I was working for us, for you. Everything I did was for you. That's what you always say. Everything was for me, but nothing was with me. Do you understand the difference?" The question hung in the air now like smoke from a fire that had burned everything down. Did she understand the difference? Sarah had thought love meant sacrifice. She had thought providing for Rachel, ensuring she had opportunities Sarah never had, was the same thing as being present. She had thought that working herself to exhaustion so Rachel could have dance lessons and a car and a college education was love in its purest form. But sitting alone in her bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of Rachel's life, But feeling completely disconnected from her daughter, Sarah began to wonder if she had built their entire relationship on a foundation that was already cracked. Chapter 3. The Weight of Memory. Sarah's phone rang at 6 in the morning. She hadn't slept, had spent the night walking from room to room in the apartment, touching things that belonged to Rachel. A sweater draped over a chair, a book left open on the coffee table, a coffee mug in the sink with lipstick on the rim. Evidence of a life that had been shared, but somehow never truly connected. Sarah, it was Margaret, Rachel's soon-to-be mother-in-law. Her voice was careful, measured. I'm calling about today. Today, the wedding day that wasn't going to happen, at least not with Sarah there. Rachel told us what happened. She's very upset. David is trying to talk to her, but she's insisting the wedding go on as planned, just without you there. Sarah felt something die inside her chest. I see. I don't think this is what she really wants, Margaret said softly. But she's angry, and when Rachel gets angry, she says things she doesn't mean. You know how she is. Did she? Did she really know how Rachel was? Sarah had missed so much of her daughter's emotional development, had been absent for the small daily moments that build understanding between people. She knew Rachel was stubborn, knew she was brilliant and driven, and sometimes cruel when she felt cornered. But did she really know her daughter's heart? I think, Sarah said carefully, that Rachel knows exactly what she wants. And it's not me. Sarah, that's not... It's okay, Sarah interrupted, though it wasn't okay at all. Nothing would ever be okay again. Tell her I hope she has a beautiful day. Tell her I love her. She hung up before Margaret could respond, before she could say something kind that would break what little composure Sarah had left. The apartment felt different now, like she was already a ghost haunting her own life. She walked to the kitchen and made coffee out of habit, then stood at the counter drinking it while staring out the window at the city waking up. Somewhere across town, her daughter was getting ready for the most important day of her life, and Sarah wasn't going to be there. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it felt almost inevitable. This was what she had earned with 32 years of loving someone more than herself. This was the reward for sacrifice that had been so complete it had erased her own identity. Chapter 4. The Archaeology of Love. By noon, Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She called in sick to work. She had never taken a day off for herself, had worked through fevers and broken bones and heartbreak. But today, she couldn't imagine facing customers who would want to chat about their weekend plans while her entire world crumbled. Instead, she began to clean out Rachel's room. It was masochistic, she knew that, but she needed to do something with her hands, needed to feel useful even if it was just organizing the remnants of a relationship that had apparently been built on resentment rather than love. Rachel's childhood bedroom was a museum of their life together, and as she sorted through boxes and drawers, she began to see patterns she had missed before. School projects where other children had drawn pictures of their families, with mothers and fathers and siblings, while Rachel had drawn just herself. Report cards full of achievements that Sarah had praised over hurried dinners before rushing off to her night job. Birthday cards Sarah had bought, but apparently never given, still in their envelopes in a drawer. She found Rachel's diary from high school, its pink cover faded with age. Sarah knew she shouldn't read it, knew it was a violation, but she was desperate to understand where everything had gone so wrong. The entries were sporadic, but a few made her hands shake. Mom missed the spring concert again. I played my solo and looked out into the audience for her, but she wasn't there. Mrs. Henderson asked if my family was coming to the reception after, and I told her my mom was working. I'm always telling people my mom is working. Sometimes I think work is more important to her than I am. Got accepted to state with a partial scholarship. Mom cried when I told her. She said she was so proud. But then she started talking about how she'd have to take on more hours to help with the rest of the tuition, and suddenly it wasn't about me anymore. It was about her sacrifice. It's always about her sacrifice. Sometimes I wish she would just ask me how I'm feeling instead of assuming she knows what I need. She thinks providing for me is the same thing as loving me. But I'd rather eat ramen every night and have her at my school play than eat steak alone while she works. Sarah closed the diary and pressed it against her chest, feeling the weight of every missed moment, every conversation they'd never had, every time she'd chosen security over presence. She had been so focused on giving Rachel a better life than she'd had that she'd forgotten to actually live that life with her. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Resentment. The photos were the hardest part. Sarah found them in a shoebox under Rachel's bed. Dozens of pictures from Rachel's childhood and teenage years. But as she looked through them, she began to notice what wasn't there. Herself. There were pictures of Rachel at birthday parties, but Sarah wasn't in them because she'd been working. Pictures from school events, but Sarah had been at her second job. Dance recitals, soccer games, graduation ceremonies, Rachel smiling and achieving and growing up, and Sarah absent from almost all of it. The few photos Sarah appeared in told their own story. She looked exhausted in every single one, her smile strained, her eyes hollow with fatigue. Even when she was physically present, she looked like someone who was running on empty, someone who had nothing left to give except the bare minimum required to get through whatever event she'd managed to attend. There was one photo that stopped Sarah cold. Rachel couldn't have been more than 8 years old, standing next to Sarah at what looked like a school fair. Rachel was beaming at the camera, her small hand reaching up to hold Sarah's. But Sarah wasn't looking at the camera or at her daughter. She was looking at her watch, already mentally somewhere else, already calculating how much time she had before her next shift started. The expression on Rachel's face as she looked up at her distracted mother was heartbreaking, hopeful, and disappointed at the same time. The face of a child who had learned not to expect too much, but couldn't help hoping anyway. Sarah sat on the floor of Rachel's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of her failures as a mother, and finally understood something she should have seen years ago. She hadn't been sacrificing for Rachel. She had been sacrificing Rachel. Every extra shift she'd picked up, every weekend she'd spent working instead of with her daughter, every time she'd prioritized providing over being present, she had been trading her daughter's emotional needs for financial security. And she had convinced herself it was noble, that it was what good mothers did. But good mothers, she realized now, found ways to be both provider and parent. Good mothers didn't use their children's gratitude as validation for their own martyrdom. Good mothers didn't build their entire identity around sacrifice and then expect their children to be grateful for what they'd lost in the process. Chapter 6. The Mirror's Truth. Sarah's phone rang at 4 o'clock. Rachel's wedding was supposed to start in 3 hours. She almost didn't answer, but some desperate part of her hoped it might be her daughter calling to say she'd changed her mind. Instead, it was David, Rachel's fiancé. Mrs. Collins? His voice was strained. I need to talk to you about Rachel. Sarah's heart clenched. Is she okay? David paused, and Sarah could hear him take a deep breath. She's been crying all morning. She keeps saying she doesn't want you at the wedding, but she's falling apart. I think she's making a mistake. David, I appreciate you calling, but Rachel was very clear about what she wants. That's just it. I don't think she knows what she wants. She's angry, and when Rachel gets angry, she pushes away the people she loves most. You know that better than anyone. Did she? Sarah was beginning to realize how little she actually knew about her daughter's emotional patterns, how many of Rachel's coping mechanisms she had missed while she was working to pay for the life she thought Rachel wanted. She told me some things, David continued carefully, about how you weren't around much when she was growing up, about how she felt like she raised herself while you worked. Each word was a knife, but Sarah forced herself to listen. But she also told me about the time you worked 3 jobs to pay for her dance camp, about how you sold your car so she could have a laptop for college, about how you never once made her feel guilty for not having a father, how you always made it seem like the two of you were a complete family. Sarah closed her eyes. That doesn't matter now. It does matter, David said urgently. Don't you see? She's not angry because you were a bad mother. She's angry because you were gone, but she can't hate you for it because she knows why you were gone. She's torn between resentment and gratitude, and she doesn't know how to process that. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that my fiancé is about to get married without her mother because she's too proud and too hurt to admit that she needs you there. And I think if you don't show up today, she'll regret it for the rest of her life. And so will you. Chapter 7. The Courage of Vulnerability. Sarah stared at the reflection in her bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was 50 years old, but looked older, worn down by decades of working multiple jobs and carrying the weight of single motherhood alone. Her hair was streaked with gray she'd never had time to color, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had spent her entire adult life putting everyone else's needs before her own. But today wasn't about her needs. Today wasn't about her hurt feelings or her wounded pride. Today was about Rachel and what Rachel needed, even if Rachel didn't know what that was. Sarah put on the dress she'd bought for the wedding, the navy blue one that had cost her 2 weeks' worth of tips. She did her makeup carefully, covering the dark circles under her eyes and the worry lines around her mouth. She looked in the mirror one more time and saw not the exhausted single mother she'd been for 32 years, but someone who was finally ready to stop being a victim of her own martyrdom. The drive to the church felt endless. Sarah's hands shook on the steering wheel as she practiced what she would say to Rachel, how she would apologize without making excuses, how she would finally take responsibility for the ways her choices had hurt her daughter. She parked 3 blocks away from the church and walked slowly toward the building, her heart pounding with every step. Cars were already arriving, wedding guests in their finest clothes, laughing and chatting as they made their way inside. Sarah felt like an imposter among them, like someone crashing a party she wasn't invited to. But as she reached the front steps of the church, she saw Margaret waiting for her. "I hoped you'd come," Margaret said softly, pulling Sarah into a quick hug. "She needs you here, whether she admits it or not." "I don't know if she'll even speak to me," Sarah admitted. "She will," Margaret said firmly. "She's my daughter-in-law now, which means I get to tell her when she's being stubborn, and she's being very stubborn." Chapter 8. The Moment of Truth. Rachel was in the bridal room, surrounded by bridesmaids and flowers and the chaos of last-minute wedding preparations. She looked breathtaking in her white dress, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her makeup perfect. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone braced for impact. When Rachel saw her mother standing in the doorway, every conversation in the room stopped. "What are you doing here?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah stepped into the room, feeling the weight of every bridesmaid's stare, every unspoken judgment about the mother who had been uninvited to her own daughter's wedding. "I came to tell you that you're right," Sarah said simply. Rachel blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "You're right about everything," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering in her chest. "I wasn't there. I missed too much. I thought providing for you was the same thing as loving you, and I was wrong." The room was so quiet, Sarah could hear her own breathing. "I thought if I could give you everything I never had, dance lessons and a car and college tuition, that would make up for not being present. I thought sacrifice meant love, but I realize now that I was sacrificing the wrong things. I was sacrificing us." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. "I know I can't change the past," Sarah said, stepping closer to her daughter. "I can't go back and attend your school plays or help you with homework instead of working. I can't undo 32 years of getting it wrong. But I can tell you that I'm sorry, and I can promise that if you'll let me, I'll do better going forward." "It's too late," Rachel whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Sarah admitted. "Maybe it is too late for me to be the mother you needed when you were 8 years old. But it's not too late for me to be the mother you need now if you'll teach me how." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped box. "I have something for you,
I was going to give it to you after the ceremony, but I don't know if there's going to be an after for us." Rachel took the box with trembling hands and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple silver locket, the kind Sarah had always wanted as a child, but could never afford. "Open it," Sarah said softly. Inside the locket was a tiny photo, not of Sarah and Rachel together, but of Rachel alone, laughing at something just outside the frame. She looked maybe 6 years old, her face bright with joy. "I took that picture the day you learned to ride your bike without training wheels. It was one of the few Sundays I didn't work, and we spent the whole afternoon in the park. You were so proud of yourself, so happy. That's how I want to remember you. Not sad because I wasn't there, but joyful because sometimes I was."
Rachel stared at the photo, tears streaming down her face. "I know you don't want me at your wedding," Sarah continued, "and I understand why. But I want you to know that even if I'm not in the church, I'm with you today. I'm with you every day, in every choice I made that was really about loving you, even when I got it wrong." Chapter 9. The Weight of Forgiveness. Rachel closed the locket and looked up at her mother, really looked at her for what felt like the first time in years. She saw not the absent mother who had haunted her childhood, but the woman who had worked herself to the bone trying to build a better life for her daughter. She saw someone who had made mistakes, but had loved her the only way she knew how. "I wanted you to come to my school play in 2nd grade," Rachel said suddenly. "Mrs. Morrison cast me as the lead in the spring production. I practiced my lines every night for weeks. I told everyone my mom was coming to see me perform." Sarah's heart broke a little more. "I remember. You were so excited. You promised you'd be there," Rachel continued, her voice shaking. "You promised. And I kept looking for you in the audience, kept waiting for you to show up. When the play was over and all the other parents came backstage with flowers, I told Mrs. Morrison you must have gotten stuck at work." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. "But you know what the worst part was?" Rachel's voice was getting stronger now, more sure. "The worst part was that I wasn't even surprised. I was disappointed, but not surprised, because you were always working, always somewhere else, always doing something more important than being with me." Sarah wanted to defend herself, to explain about the bills and the fear and the desperate need to provide security for her child. But she forced herself to stay quiet, to really hear what Rachel was saying. "I spent my whole childhood feeling like I wasn't enough. If I was a better daughter, a more important daughter, you'd want to spend time with me instead of working all the time." "Oh, sweetheart. It was never about you not being enough. You were everything. You are everything. Then why did you choose work over me?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and painful and decades overdue. Sarah took a deep breath. "Because I was scared. Because I was 19 years old and alone and terrified that I couldn't give you what you deserved. Because my own mother never provided for me. And I was so determined not to fail you the way she failed me, that I failed you in a completely different way." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I chose work over presents because I thought money was love. I thought if I could just provide enough, sacrifice enough, you'd never doubt that you were wanted and cherished. I thought struggling financially would hurt you more than my absence would. I was wrong." Rachel was crying openly now, and Sarah wanted nothing more than to hold her daughter, but she didn't know if she had the right. "I know I can't fix what I broke. I know I can't give you the childhood you deserved, the mother who showed up and paid attention and put you first. But I love you, Rachel. I have loved you every single day of your life, even when I was loving you wrong." Chapter 10. The Bridge Between Hearts. For a long moment, mother and daughter just looked at each other across the chasm of hurt and misunderstanding that had defined their relationship for so many years. The room was silent, except for the sound of Rachel's quiet crying and the distant music of the ceremony about to begin. Then Rachel did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped forward and hugged her mother.
It wasn't a Hollywood moment of instant reconciliation. It was tentative and awkward and full of the weight of everything that had gone wrong between them. But it was real, and it was a beginning. "I don't know how to forgive you," Rachel whispered against her mother's shoulder. "But I don't know how not to love you either." Sarah held her daughter carefully, afraid to hold too tight, afraid to let go. "I don't need forgiveness right now," she said softly. "I just need you to know that I see you. I see how my choices hurt you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for several minutes. Two women who had loved each other imperfectly for 3 decades, finally finding a way to be honest about the cost of that love. "I want you to walk me down the aisle," Rachel said suddenly, pulling back to look at her mother. "I know I said I didn't want you here, but I was wrong. I was hurt and angry, and I said things I didn't mean." Sarah's heart soared, but she forced herself to think about what Rachel really needed. "Are you sure? This is your day. You don't have to include me just because I showed up." "I'm not," Rachel said firmly. "I'm including you because despite everything that went wrong between us, you're still my mother. You're still the person who taught me to be strong and independent and to fight for what I want. You're still the reason I had the opportunities that led me to David, that led me to this life." She took Sarah's hands in hers. "I don't forgive you yet," she said honestly. "I'm still angry about a lot of things, and I think we need to talk about them. Really talk, not just apologize and move on. But I love you, Mom, and I want you here today." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in days, they were tears of relief rather than despair. "I love you too," she said, "more than I ever knew how to show you." Chapter 11. The Walk Toward Tomorrow. The music began 20 minutes later, and Sarah found herself standing at the back of the church with her daughter, both of them trying not to cry and ruin their makeup. Rachel looked radiant, her earlier tears replaced by a glow that had nothing to do with professional styling and everything to do with the peace that comes from finally speaking difficult truths. "Ready?" Sarah asked, offering her arm to her daughter. Rachel took it, and together they began the slow walk down the aisle. Sarah could feel every eye in the church on them, could sense the whispered questions about the mother who had almost been banned from her own daughter's wedding. But she kept her focus forward, on David, waiting at the altar with a relieved smile on his face, and on the promise of a future where she and Rachel might finally learn to love each other well. As they walked, Sarah thought about all the moments she had missed, all the times she had prioritized the wrong things, all the ways she had failed to show up for the person who mattered most. But she also thought about the future, about grandchildren she might actually be present for, about conversations she and Rachel still needed to have, about the possibility of building something new from the rubble of what they'd lost. When they reached the altar, Rachel turned to face her mother one more time. The church was silent, waiting for the moment when the bride would be given away. "I'm not giving you away," Sarah said softly, just loud enough for Rachel to hear. "I'm finally learning to show up." Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her daughter in months. "I'm not going anywhere either," she whispered back. Sarah kissed her daughter's cheek and stepped aside, taking her place in the front pew. As the ceremony began, as Rachel and David exchanged vows about loving each other through good times and bad, through presence and absence, through the messy reality of human relationship, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For 32 years, she had defined herself by what she sacrificed for her daughter. Today, for the first time, she was defining herself by what she was willing to receive. Forgiveness she hadn't earned, love she didn't deserve, and the chance to finally learn how to be the mother Rachel needed her to be. Chapter 12. The Art of Beginning Again. 6 months later, Sarah sat across from Rachel in a coffee shop downtown, their monthly lunch date already a treasured routine. The conversation had been difficult at first. Years of resentment and misunderstanding don't disappear overnight, but they were both committed to the hard work of rebuilding their relationship. "I've been thinking about something you said at the wedding," Rachel said, stirring sugar into her latte. "About learning to show up." Sarah looked up from her salad, waiting. I think I need to learn that too, she continued. I spent so many years being angry about what you weren't that I never really appreciated what you were. You worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. You never made me feel ashamed about not having a father. You taught me to be independent and strong, even if you taught me by example rather than by presence. Sarah's heart tightened with emotion, but she forced herself to listen rather than deflect with gratitude she didn't deserve. I'm not saying the hurt goes away, Rachel said carefully. I'm not saying I don't still wish things had been different, but I'm learning to hold both things at once, the hurt and the gratitude, the resentment and the love. That sounds exhausting, Sarah said softly. It is, but it's also honest, and I think we need to be honest with each other if we're going to make this work. Sarah nodded. They had both learned through months of difficult conversations and family therapy sessions that love without honesty was just another form of absence. They were learning to be present with the messy reality of their relationship instead of trying to pretend the past hadn't happened or didn't matter. I have something to tell you, Rachel said, her voice suddenly shy. Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. 32 years of being Rachel's mother had trained her to expect bad news. I'm pregnant, Rachel said, her face breaking into a smile. Just 8 weeks, but David and I wanted to wait until we were sure before we told anyone. Oh my God, Rachel. Oh my God. I know it's early and I know we haven't figured everything out between us yet, but I want this baby to know their grandmother. I want them to have what I missed. The presence, the attention, the feeling of being someone's priority. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. I want that too, she managed, more than I ever knew how to show you.
It won't be the same as starting over, Rachel warned. I can't forget what it felt like to grow up feeling like I came second to your work. But I can choose to believe that you've learned from those mistakes, that you'll do better this time. Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. I will, she promised. I don't know how to be a grandmother, but I know how to show up. I'm finally learning how to show up. Rachel squeezed her mother's hand. We're both learning, she said. That's what love is, isn't it? Learning how to do it better, even when you've been doing it wrong for a long time. Sarah nodded, thinking about all the ways she had equated love with sacrifice, presence with providing, care with carrying the weight of the world alone. She thought about the woman she had been at 19, scared and overwhelmed and convinced that love meant working herself to death for someone else's benefit. She thought about the woman she was now, 50 years old, and finally learning that love, real love, required her to be present, not perfect, required her to show up, not just provide, required her to receive as well as give, to be vulnerable as well as strong. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. For what? For giving me another chance, for teaching me what I should have learned 30 years ago. For loving me even when I didn't know how to love you back. Rachel smiled, and in that moment, Sarah saw not the hurt child who had grown up feeling invisible, but the strong, generous woman her daughter had become despite her mother's failures. We're going to do this right, Rachel said. All of it. The grandmother thing, the mother-daughter thing, the family thing. We're going to do it right this time. Sarah nodded, feeling lighter than she had in decades. Yes, she said. We are. Outside the coffee shop, the city hummed with its usual energy. People rushing to work, to appointments, to the endless demands of daily life. But inside, 2 women sat holding hands across a small table, finally learning that the most important work of all was the work of being present for each other. It had taken them 32 years to get to this moment. 32 years of loving each other imperfectly and hurting each other unintentionally, and finding their way back to each other despite the weight of their mistakes. But they had found their way back. And for the first time in decades, Sarah wasn't thinking about all the time they had lost. She was thinking about all the time they had left to get it right. The end. Epilogue. 3 years later, Sarah held her 18-month-old granddaughter on her lap,
reading the same story they had read together every Tuesday afternoon for the past year. Emma giggled and pointed at the pictures, her chubby fingers leaving smudges on the pages that Sarah would never dream of wiping away. Again, Gamma, again. Sarah laughed and turned back to the first page, marveling at how different this felt from the frantic, exhausted early days of Rachel's childhood. This time, she wasn't mentally calculating how many bills she could pay during nap time or whether she could squeeze in a load of laundry before Emma woke up. This time, she was simply present, fully engaged in the simple miracle of a child who knew her grandmother loved her. Rachel appeared in the doorway, watching them with a smile. "You spoil her." But she had no criticism in her voice, only warmth. "That's what grandmothers are for," Sarah replied, tickling Emma's belly and eliciting another cascade of giggles. Rachel settled onto the couch beside them, and for a moment, 3 generations of women sat together in Sarah's living room, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a life finally lived with intention, rather than just survival. "I've been thinking," Rachel said softly, "about what I want to tell Emma about our family, about what happened between us." Sarah looked up from the book, waiting. "I want to tell her the truth, that love is complicated, that people make mistakes, that families break and heal and break again. But mostly, I want to tell her that it's never too late to learn how to love someone better." "I think that's perfect," Sarah said. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude now, not grief. Emma squirmed in Sarah's lap, demanding attention. "Story, Gamma." Sarah looked down at her granddaughter, this beautiful, confident child who would grow up knowing she was prioritized, cherished, seen. And then at her daughter, who had found the courage to forgive without forgetting, to love without conditions, to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, opening the book to the first page, "there was a little girl who taught her grandmother to love better." Emma clapped her hands in delight. Rachel smiled, and Sarah continued reading, presence for every word, grateful for every moment, finally understanding that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon with her daughter and granddaughter was what love looked like when you got it right.
The story had begun with words that shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about motherhood and sacrifice and love. But it was ending with different words, gentler words, words that built bridges instead of walls. Once upon a time, there was a family that learned to love each other exactly as they were, while helping each other become who they were meant to be. The weight of love, Sarah had learned, wasn't meant to crush you. It was meant to ground you, to give you something solid to stand on while you figured out how to do better, be better, love better. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it gave you a second chance to get it right. Outside, the afternoon sun was setting, painting the walls of Sarah's apartment in shades of gold and amber. Emma had fallen asleep in her grandmother's arms, her small body warm and trusting, her breathing soft and steady. Rachel had curled up beside them, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder, and for the first time in 35 years, Sarah felt complete. Not because she had finally gotten everything right, but because she had finally learned that love wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. It was about showing up again and again, even when you'd failed before. It was about the courage to say, "I'm sorry," and the grace to say, "I forgive you," and the wisdom to know that both were necessary for love to survive. The story of Sarah and Rachel wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic wand that erased the years of hurt, no dramatic gesture that made everything perfect. There were still difficult days, still moments when old wounds reopened, still times when they both reverted to their old patterns of hurt and defense. But there was also this: a grandmother reading to her granddaughter while her daughter dozed peacefully beside them. There was forgiveness that had been earned through consistent action rather than grand gestures. There was love that had been rebuilt from the ground up, stronger for having been broken and carefully mended. The apartment that had once felt like a shrine to Sarah's failures now felt like home. The photos on the walls told a different story now, not just of missed moments and absent mothers, but of second chances and new beginnings.
There were pictures of Rachel's wedding day, with Sarah beaming as she walked her daughter down the aisle. Pictures of Emma's first steps, with Sarah there to witness and celebrate. Pictures of 3 generations of women learning to love each other better. And in the center of it all, in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, was the locket Sarah had given Rachel on her wedding day. Rachel had framed the tiny photo from inside it. Not the sad image of a mother missing her daughter's childhood, but the joyful image of a daughter who had been loved, even when that love had been imperfect. The sun finished setting, and Sarah carefully shifted Emma in her arms, preparing to put her down for her evening nap before David came to pick them up. Rachel stirred beside her, blinking awake with the disoriented expression of someone emerging from an unexpected sleep. "How long was I out?" she asked, stretching. "About 20 minutes. I thought you looked peaceful. I didn't want to wake you." Rachel smiled, that easy smile that had taken years to return to their relationship. Being a working mom is exhausting. She then paused, realizing what she had said. "I know what you mean," Sarah said gently. "And you're right, it is exhausting. But you're doing it differently than I did. Better than I did." "Not better," Rachel corrected. "Just different. I have advantages you didn't have. David to share the load, a more stable job, family to help out." She looked at her mother meaningfully. "I have you to help out." Sarah felt that familiar tightness in her throat, the emotion that still overwhelmed her sometimes when she was reminded of how much their relationship had changed. "I'm grateful you trust me with her," she said, looking down at Emma's sleeping face. "You've earned that trust," Rachel said simply. "Every Tuesday for the past year and a half, you've been here. Not working, not distracted, not somewhere else. Just here. Present. Focused on her. On us." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of that observation. Consistency, she had learned, was its own form of love. Small acts repeated over time, presence chosen again and again, attention given freely and without conditions, these were the building blocks of trust, the foundation of relationships that could weather disappointment and hurt. The doorbell rang, and they both knew it was David coming to collect his wife and daughter. But neither of them moved immediately. They sat in the gathering dusk, 3 generations of women connected by love that had been broken and mended, stretched and tested, lost and found again. "Same time next Tuesday?" Rachel asked, as she had every week for the past 18 months. "Same time next Tuesday," Sarah confirmed, as she had every week for the past 18 months. It was such a small thing, a simple weekly commitment, but it was everything. It was the promise that had replaced all the broken promises of Rachel's childhood. It was the presence that had filled the absence that had defined their relationship for so many years. It was the proof that people could change, that families could heal, that love could learn to do better. As Rachel gathered Emma's things and Sarah walked them to the door, she thought about the woman she had been just a few years ago, bitter, defensive, convinced that her sacrifices had been unappreciated and her love unrecognized. She thought about the daughter who had stood in this same hallway and told her that the best gift she could give was to disappear from her life. Those people felt like strangers now, like characters in someone else's story. The woman Sarah was now understood that love wasn't a competition between who had sacrificed more or suffered more or deserved more gratitude. Love was a choice made new every day, a commitment to show up even when it was hard, a decision to prioritize relationship over resentment. The daughter, Rachel, was now understood that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that healing didn't require pretending the past hadn't happened. She had learned that it was possible to acknowledge hurt while still choosing love, to honor the child she had been while embracing the mother she was becoming. "I love you, Mom," Rachel said as she stood in the doorway, Emma drowsy in her arms. "I love you too," Sarah replied and meant it in ways she was still learning to understand. After they left, Sarah cleaned up the toys scattered around her living room and put away the books they'd read together. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window where she'd spent so many evenings over the years worrying about money and work and whether she was failing her daughter. The view from the window was the same, but everything else had changed. The anxiety that had driven her for so many years had been replaced by a different kind of energy. Not the frantic need to prove herself through sacrifice, but the steady commitment to show up authentically and consistently. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Emma fell asleep in the car before we got home. She was talking about Gamma Book all the way to David's office. Thank you for today. Thank you for every Tuesday. Thank you for learning how to be the grandmother she deserves and the mother I needed you to become. She read the message twice, then set her phone aside and looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere across town, her daughter was putting her granddaughter to bed, probably reading one more story even though Emma was already asleep. Somewhere across town, David was making dinner, while Rachel told him about their afternoon at Grandma's house. Somewhere across town, a family was living the life Sarah had worked so hard to provide, but had been too absent to enjoy. But she was part of that family now, not as the martyred provider working herself to death in service of people who didn't appreciate her sacrifice, but as the grandmother who showed up, the mother who listened, the woman who had finally learned that love was a verb that required presence to conjugate properly. The weight of love, Sarah realized, sitting in her chair with her tea growing cold in her hands, wasn't meant to be carried alone. It was meant to be shared, the burden and the joy, the responsibility and the reward, the daily choice to prioritize relationship over everything else that seemed urgent but wasn't actually important. She had spent 32 years learning to love wrong, and 3 years learning to love better. She suspected she would spend the rest of her life continuing to learn, continuing to grow, continuing to show up for the people who mattered most. But for tonight, for this moment, it was enough to sit in the quiet of her apartment and know that she was loved and trusted and needed, not for what she could provide or sacrifice, but for who she was becoming one Tuesday afternoon at a time. The story that had begun with the cruelest words a daughter could speak to her mother, "The best gift you could give me is to disappear from my life," had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. A love story about second chances, about the courage to change, about families that break and heal and find their way back to each other through the simple, revolutionary act of showing up. And tomorrow, Sarah would wake up and go to work at the diner, not because she had to support herself and her daughter on poverty wages, but because she enjoyed the rhythm of the job and the relationships with regular customers. Tomorrow, she would come home to an apartment that felt like a haven rather than a way station between shifts. Tomorrow, she would call Rachel to check in, not out of anxiety or guilt, but out of genuine interest in her daughter's life. And next Tuesday, she would be here again, ready to read stories and play games and be fully present for her granddaughter, proving week by week that love could learn to do better, that families could heal, that it was never too late to become the person your loved ones needed you to be. The weight of love, Sarah had finally learned, was not a burden to be carried alone. It was a foundation to build on, a reason to keep growing, a promise that tomorrow could be different from yesterday if you were willing to do the work of showing up. And Sarah Collins, 53 years old, and finally learning how to love well, was more than willing to do that work for the rest of her life.